Commanders, your probability models have a critical flaw in the supply chain extrapolation. We need to recalculate.
The Keth War Council had been running the numbers for 11 hours when the humans stood up and said, quietly, that they were all asking the wrong question. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. 11 hours of calculation, of loss projections and territorial models and probability matrices that accounted for everything from orbital debris patterns to the psychological fragmentation rates of frontline infantry, and the human, who had been sitting in the back corner of the room with bad posture and a styrofoam cup of something that smelled burnt, had just told them they were wrong. Commander Irath Solon of the Keth Second Coalition looked at the human the way you look at something that has just made an unexpected sound. Her secondary eyes, the smaller pair set above the primary set, used in combat for peripheral threat detection, had gone fully open, which the rest of the room understood immediately as an involuntary response to the possibility of danger. The human's name was Specialist Diane Ockafer. She was a logistics analyst. She was 34 years old, and she had a sister in Lagos who sent her audio messages every Sunday that she never had enough time to answer properly. She had been assigned to the Joint Coalition Advisory Council as part of the Treaty of Marin's requirement for human representation in any military action that might affect the contested corridor, which included the three systems where Earth had trade interests. She was not a soldier. She had never fired a weapon in her life. She had a degree in supply chain optimization and a secondary qualification in xenopsychology that she'd picked up because she'd had a lot of time on the long transit to Keth space, and the course materials were in the ship's database. She was also, at this moment, the most dangerous person in the room, though nobody knew that yet, including her. Specialist, said Irath Solon, in the careful formal register the Keth used when managing uncertainty. You have reviewed the projections. I've reviewed the projections, Diane said. And you believe they are incorrect. I believe they're answering a question nobody should be asking, she said, which is related but different. The silence in the room was the particular silence of very powerful people who are deciding whether they are offended. The Keth War Council was not a body accustomed to being told it was looking at the wrong map. It was composed of 11 of the most decorated military strategists in the Second Coalition, several of whom had planned campaigns that had reshaped territorial boundaries across 4 systems. They had titles that did not translate cleanly into any human language, ranks that encoded not just authority, but the specific type of thinking you were authorized to do, the particular shape of the decisions you were trusted to make. Diane Ockafer had a laminated badge and a temporary seating assignment. She remained standing. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the situation the Council had been calculating for 11 hours. The Great Expansion, a coalition of 4 species who had, over the preceding 18 years, collectively decided that their combined military and economic weight entitled them to stop negotiating and start simply taking, had moved 3 of their heavy engagement fleets into position along the outer boundary of the Keth contested corridor. This was not a new development. The Gret had been making incremental territorial moves for a decade, each one small enough to contest diplomatically, each one adding to a pattern that, taken whole, described something very large and very deliberate. The most recent move was different. They had seized a relay station, not a military installation but a civilian communications hub, the kind of infrastructure that entire supply chains hung on, and they had done it quietly, with no declaration, in a window between scheduled inspections. By the time the Second Coalition's intelligence apparatus understood what had happened, the station had been occupied and resupplied, and the Gret's legal instruments were in motion to retroactively claim it under the expansion's territorial rights framework, which was the kind of document that had been drafted specifically to make things like this possible. The Council's projections were in essence calculations of the following. How much force would be required to retake the relay station, what it would cost in ships and crew and political capital, how long the engagement would take, and what the probability was that the Gret would escalate in response. There were 17 different engagement models on the table. They ranged from a surgical strike with minimal losses to a full defensive posture with no offensive action at all, accepting the station's loss and strengthening the next layer of infrastructure. Every model assumed the same thing. The relay station was, for practical purposes, gone. The question was only what you spent Ying to get it back. Diane had been reading these projections for 11 hours, and she had been getting a feeling she recognized from her logistics work. The specific itching sensation of a problem that everyone around you is solving at the wrong level of abstraction. It was the feeling she got when she was brought in to optimize a supply chain and found that the supply chain was actually fine, but the demand forecasting was broken, and no amount of supply chain optimization was going to fix a broken demand forecast because those were two different problems. She had tried twice to mention this politely through the designated channels for advisory input. She had submitted a formal query to the council's information officer, who had logged it and assured her it would be considered. She had flagged it in the written addendum system that the Treaty of Marin required the council to maintain. Nothing had changed about the projections. So she stood up. The question you're all answering, Diane said, is how much it costs to respond to what the Gret have already done. Irath Solan's secondary eyes were still fully open. She said, "That is the question before the council." "That's what I mean," Diane said. "That's the question the Gret want you to be answering. They set this up so that every response available to you is a response to something finished. You're calculating how to answer a move that is already over. And while you're doing that, they're making the next move." A silence. "We are aware of the Gret's pattern of incremental action," said Subcommander Vethais, who was the youngest member of the council and had the particular bristling quality of someone who has worked very hard to earn a seat at a table and is not thrilled about being taught at it. "This has been factored into the projections." "Has it?" Diane said. She was not trying to be difficult. She genuinely wanted to know. Which model accounts for what the Gret's actual objective is, not the relay station. The relay station is a move. What's the game? Another silence, this one slightly longer. "The game," Vethais said carefully, "is territorial expansion." "Sure," Diane said, "but what does the relay station give them specifically, not the territory, the station? What does that station do?" Irath Solan said, "It is a communications hub for civilian supply infrastructure in the corridor." "Right," Diane said, "it's a node. It's a specific node in a network, and networks," she paused. She looked around the room. She pulled up the digital overlay she'd been building for the last 3 hours on her personal display and pushed it to the main council screen, because the Treaty of Marin also gave her display sharing privileges, and she had confirmed this with the information officer before she'd started building anything, because she was not impulsive by nature, and she understood the value of standing on firm procedural ground before you did something that might otherwise look like overreach. The council looked at the screen. What they saw was a network map of the contested corridor's civilian communications infrastructure. Diane had built it from the public logistics data she had access to as part of her advisory role, supplemented by the supply chain records that the human trade interests maintained in the corridor, which she had authorization to review. The relay station the Gret had seized was highlighted. Around it, the map showed 17 other nodes, relay stations, communications hubs, routing infrastructure, connected by lines of varying thickness that represented traffic volume. 4 of those nodes were highlighted in a different color. "These 4, Diane said, are the only other nodes capable of absorbing the relay station's traffic load if it goes dark. The Gret know this. They seized the relay station not because it's strategically valuable by itself, but because seizing it shows them which of these four will be most stressed under load. It's a diagnostic. They're using it to figure out where the network is weak before they take the next thing. The room was very quiet. Irath Solon was looking at the map with an expression that Diane's translation chip flagged as requiring careful interpretation. It was somewhere in the range of what the chip labeled strategic reassessment, which in the Keth context described the specific experience of a commander who has just understood that the battle they thought they were fighting is not the one they are in. You are saying, Irath Solon said slowly, that the seizure was never intended to be permanent. I'm saying it doesn't have to be permanent for it to succeed, Diane said. If you spend the next 6 months fighting to retake the station, you're not hardening those 4 nodes, and by the end of those 6 months, they'll know exactly which one to hit next. Vethai said this is a logical analysis of the network pattern. It does not tell us how to respond. No, Diane said, "Th." That's true. She picked up her styrofoam cup and drank from it. The coffee was cold and had been cold for 2 hours, and she drank it anyway because she had learned a long time ago that waiting for conditions to be perfect before you acted was its own kind of paralysis. But it tells us what we're actually protecting, and what we're actually protecting is the network, not the station. So the question isn't how much it costs to take the station back. The question is what would it cost to make the next move unavailable to them entirely. Well, the council recessed. Diane went and sat in the hallway outside the chamber and ate a nutrient bar from her bag and answered 2 of her sister's audio messages, or started to, and then stopped because she couldn't find the right words and she didn't want to send something rushed. She put her tablet away and looked at the corridor wall, which was the standard Keth military composite, a material that was technically gray, but that caught the station's light in a way that made it look faintly bronze, like old metal, like something that had been there a long time. She had been doing this work, the advisory work, the coalition liaison role, for 8 months. Before that, she had spent 6 years doing supply chain optimization for the human logistics firm that held the contested corridor trade contracts, which mostly meant a great deal of spreadsheet work and an embarrassing number of video calls with people in 14 different time zones. She was good at it. She was good at seeing the whole structure of a system rather than just the part that was currently making noise. Her supervisor had once described this, not entirely as a compliment, as an almost troubling ability to care more about the shape of the problem than the urgency of the symptom. She thought about that now. She thought about the council in there running the numbers again. She thought about how they were very good at what they did. She had never doubted that, had never walked into that room thinking she was smarter than 11 decorated commanders with centuries of combined strategic experience. But she had also worked long enough in logistics to know that expertise in a domain could sometimes be exactly what stopped you from seeing the domain's edge. When you were very good at winning certain kinds of engagements, you got very fast at recognizing the shape of those engagements and very good at responding to them. And occasionally the real problem was not shaped like that at all. She finished the nutrient bar. She folded the wrapper carefully and tucked it in her bag because she had been raised by a woman who believed that littering was a personal moral, failing regardless of how small the litter was. And that particular belief had proven remarkably durable across 3 decades and 2-star systems. After 40 minutes, the council's information officer came to find her. "The commander would like you to return," he said. "Oh, she went back in. They worked for 14 more hours." Diane did not stand and speak again. She sat at the table this time. Irath Solon had moved her from the advisory section to the working group, which was a procedural step that the information officer confirmed had treaty implications she was not immediately sure how to process. And she answered questions when they were put to her, and she offered information when she had it, and she kept her mouth shut when she didn't. The questions were very specific. They were the questions of people who have redirected their analytical power toward a new problem and are running very fast in the new direction. They wanted to know about the network. They wanted traffic load data and redundancy margins and the timeline required to harden each of the 4 vulnerable nodes, and the supply chain implications of routing around the seized relay station while the hardening work was completed. They wanted to know which of the 4 nodes was most stressed under current conditions, and which could absorb load fastest, and what the Human Trade Consortium's position would be on contributing to infrastructure hardening in exchange for priority routing. She answered all of this. Most of it she knew. Some of it she had to look up. When she had to look up, she said so and she looked it up and she did not pretend certainty she didn't have, which she had observed was an instinct that seemed to become more difficult for people the higher they rose in organizational hierarchies, and which she considered one of the more important things she'd managed to hold on to. At 3 in the morning, station time, Irath Solon called a short break and walked to the edge of the room where Diane was refilling her cup from the coffee service. She had discovered behind a panel that she was fairly certain was not supposed to be used by advisory personnel, but which nobody had told her directly not to use. And this had seemed like enough latitude. The commander stood beside her for a moment. "Zaiwa, NT to ask you something," Irath Solon said. "All right," Diane said. "When you stood up earlier," the commander said, "you understood that the council could have dismissed you, that it was within our authority to log your advisory input as received and continue without any obligation to act on it." "Oh yes," Diane said. "And you stood anyway." "I stood anyway," Diane said. "Why?" She poured her coffee. She thought about it honestly, the way she had learned to think about things, not reaching for the answer that sounded good, but actually looking for the true one, which was sometimes smaller and less elegant than the sound-good version. "Because I could see something that I didn't think anyone else in the room had seen yet," she said. "And if I was wrong, the cost of me standing up was embarrassment and maybe a formal note in my file. And if I was right and I didn't say anything, the cost of that was," she gestured vaguely toward the map that was still on the main display. "The network, the 4 vulnerable nodes, everything that hung on them. Bigger." Irath Solon was very still. "You calculated a different thing than we were calculating," she said. "I calculated what it cost to stay quiet," Diane said. "Everyone else was calculating what it cost to act. Those aren't the same calculation." The commander looked at her for a long moment. Among the Keth, Diane had learned, silence between 2 people in conversation was not an absence of communication but a form of it. The Keth had a word not in their formal language but in the specific dialect spoken between warriors of equal standing, for the kind of silence that meant I am taking your measure and finding it worth my continued attention. She did not know if Irath Solon considered her a warrior. She suspected the categories were not quite built for this situation. "On our world," Irath Solon said finally, "we have a saying. There are those who are brave because they do not understand the danger, and there are those who are brave because they have understood the danger and decided it is not the most important thing." A pause. "We have always assumed only the second kind mattered." "Okay," Diane said. "I am revising this assumption," Irath Solon said. "You are brave because you are running a different calculation entirely. The danger is in your accounting. You simply weighted other variables higher." Diane drank her coffee. "I'd call it less brave and more I couldn't not say anything. Staying quiet felt like lying. And I'm not good at lying, so I avoid situations where I'd have to do it for long." "In the Keth tradition," Irath Solon said, "this quality has a name. The word is Sethavar. It describes a warrior who cannot be made to look away from a thing once they have seen it. We consider it," a pause, "something almost careful in it. It is considered both a gift and a burden because you cannot unsee things, and the world is very full of things." Diane thought about that. She thought about the relay station map she'd built at 1 in the morning on a logistics database and the feeling that had been itching at her for 11 hours before she'd finally stood up. She thought about all the things she had seen in 8 months of coalition work that she hadn't known what to do with, that she had filed and noted and flagged through appropriate channels and sometimes, more often than she was comfortable with, watched go nowhere. Yeah, she said, I know the filings. The plan they built over the following 36 hours was not a military plan in any recognizable sense. There were no engagement models. There were no probability matrices for fleet combat. There were no calculations of acceptable loss rates. Diane worked alongside three Keth strategic planners who were, she suspected, probably the best logistics minds on the council. The ones who had been assigned to the engagement models because supply lines were always part of military planning, which meant they were used to thinking about systems and flows rather than just force and counterforce. What they built was a resilience architecture. The four vulnerable nodes would be hardened, expanded, rerouted, provided with redundant relay capacity, within a timeline that Diane's supply chain analysis said was achievable if the Human Trade Consortium contributed their own infrastructure contracts to the effort, which she had verified she was authorized to commit to on a preliminary basis pending formal approval from her firm's board, which she had messaged at 2 in the morning, and which had responded with an enthusiasm she had found encouraging. The seized relay station would be rerouted around. Its traffic would be distributed across the four nodes in a load-balanced pattern that would, paradoxically, make the network more robust than it had been before the seizure. Within 90 days, the station would be, from a functional standpoint, largely irrelevant. The Gret would still hold it, it would still be a violation. There were diplomatic processes underway for that, slow processes, the kind that moved at the speed of interstellar law. But it would no longer be a diagnostic. It would no longer tell them where to hit next. Because Diane's team had looked at every node in the network and asked, what would happen if this one went dark? And for each one, they had built an answer. Vethais, to his credit, had come around. Not immediately, not even quickly, but at the 18-hour mark when the resilience architecture was taking shape and the numbers were starting to show what the hardened network would look like, and more importantly, what it would look like to the Gret, who would be running their own numbers. He had sat down next to Diane with a coffee he'd poured himself from behind the panel she'd found, and he had looked at the map for a long time. The station becomes a monument to their miscalculation, he said. They seized it to find our weakness. We remove the weakness. Now they hold a thing that accomplished nothing. That's the idea, Diane said. It will not humiliate them, Vethais said. They will not lose ships. Their commanders will not be dishonored. No, she said. In Keth tradition, he said carefully, a victory that does not cost the enemy something visible is considered, he paused, incomplete. I know, she said, I read the cultural briefings. And she thought about it. She looked at the map, the whole network, all the nodes, the lines of traffic that represented supply chains that represented actual people and actual goods, and the actual daily functioning of actual lives in the contested corridor. The Gret are going to spend the next year figuring out why their diagnostic failed, she said. They're going to look for the weakness they thought they'd found, and they're not going to find it. They'll spend analysts, they'll spend planning cycles, they'll burn internal political capital arguing about what went wrong. She looked at Vethais. Meanwhile, every system in this corridor is going to be running on infrastructure that's more solid than it's ever been. 15 years from now, nobody's going to remember why these four nodes got upgraded. They'll just know they work. Vethais was quiet for a while. You are describing a victory that is invisible, he said. I'm describing a victory that doesn't need to be seen to be real, she said. He was quiet for a long time after that, the kind of Keth silence that meant something. Irath Solon presented the architecture to the full council at the 38-hour mark. Diane sat in her chair, the working group chair, not the back corner advisory chair, and listened. She watched the 11 commanders process the plan, Watch the resistance move through the room in the way resistance always moved through rooms, hitting the people who were most invested in the old question before softening as the new question became visible. The hardest moment was when General Savath Kren, the eldest member of the council and the one with the most decorated record, asked plainly, "Where is the moment we strike back?" Irath Solon said, "We are proposing that striking back is not the correct response." "We are the second coalition," Savath Kren said. "We have never accepted a territorial violation without a military response. If we accept it now." "We are not accepting it," Irath Solon said. "We are refusing to fight on the ground the Gret selected. We are selecting our own ground." "And the ground we are selecting," Savath Kren said, with the weight of 40 years of command in his voice, "was mapped by a human logistics analyst." The room was very still. Diane did not look away from the general. She had a feeling that looking away would be the wrong thing, for reasons she couldn't entirely articulate but trusted. Savath Kren looked at her for a long moment. He had the deep, still gaze of old soldiers everywhere, the kind of eyes that have seen too many things to be easily surprised and too many things to be easily at peace. He was reading her the way commanders read terrain, for what was solid, what would hold, what would give way under pressure. "You are not a warrior," he said, not unkindly, just as a fact. "No," she said. "What are you?" She thought about it, honestly, the way she always did. "I'm someone who's good at seeing how things connect," she said, "at understanding what a system is actually doing versus what it looks like it's doing. I spent 6 years making sure the right goods arrived at the right places at the right times, which sounds very boring," she paused. "And is very boring, but it turns out that if you do it long enough, you start to understand that almost every crisis is a logistics crisis underneath. People don't fight over ideas as often as they fight over who controls the flow of things. Territory, resources, communications, infrastructure. It's always about the network." Savath Kren was very still. "Then the Gret, re-attacking the network," he said, not as a question, as if he was placing a piece somewhere it now fit. "The Gret are attacking the network," she said, "and everyone in this room has been trained to respond to attacks on territory, on ships, on military installations. You are very good at that, but the network isn't military infrastructure, it's civilian. It runs differently, it fails differently, and it can be hardened in ways that don't require anyone to fire a weapon." The general looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked at the map. Then he looked at his hands, which was a gesture Diane's cultural briefings told her was a Keth commander's way of checking their own judgment, a kind of private consultation, an acknowledgement that the decision being made was weighty enough to require a moment's pause before carrying it. "I have fought," Savath Kren said quietly, "in 4 campaigns across 30 years. I have calculated in each of them the cost of action and the cost of inaction. I have always understood these as military calculations." He looked up. "You are telling me there is a third calculation?" "Oh yes," Diane said. "What do you call it?" She thought about this for a moment. She did not have a single word for it. She had never needed a single word before. "The cost of looking at the wrong thing," she said finally. "Spending every resource you have answering a question that was designed to distract you. The Gret didn't seize that station because they wanted the station. They seized it because they knew exactly how you'd respond. They've been watching you for 18 years. They know your doctrine. They know your response patterns. They built a move that fit perfectly into the shape of how you think about conflict. Because they knew you'd spend the next year executing your doctrine perfectly in response to a move they'd already moved past." The silence in the room was the longest it had been. Savath Kren said, "And you saw this." "I'm good at seeing how things connect," she said again. "Yes," he said slowly. "You said that." He was quiet for a moment. "We have a word, the Keth Sethavar, it means." "I know," she said. "Commander Irath Solon explained it to me." He looked at her with something she could not quite name. She did. Oh, yes. And what did you make of it? Diane thought about the things she could not stop seeing once she had seen them. The network map she'd built at 1 in the morning, the relay station's traffic patterns, the 4 nodes, the itch that had been running under her skin for 11 hours in a room full of people running the wrong calculation. She thought about her sister's audio messages that she hadn't answered properly. She thought about the nutrient bar wrapper in her bag. She thought about the specific cold burnt taste of 3 in the morning coffee poured from a service that was probably not for her. I thought, she said carefully, that it sounded less like a gift and more like a responsibility. Once you've seen the shape of a problem, you're responsible for it. You can't give the responsibility to someone else just because you're not technically the person whose job it is to carry it. Savath Kren looked at her for a very long time. Then he said, in the formal register that among the Keth was used for statements of official weight, the council will hear this proposal in full. The vote was 9-2. The 2 who voted against were not wrong exactly. Their objections were the objections of people who were right about certain things, about the importance of visible deterrence, about the message that a non-military response might send, about the complexity of asking a warrior culture to celebrate an invisible victory. These were real concerns. They would need to be managed. But 9 voted for. Diane found out the result from the information officer while she was in the corridor outside, answering her sister's messages properly this time, because she had been awake for 38 hours and she was not going to be able to sleep until she had actually answered them. And she had decided that some things were worth doing before you slept even if you were very tired. Her sister's most recent message was about her daughter, who was 12 and had apparently decided she wanted to learn to play the piano, which their family could not entirely afford but which her sister was going to find a way to make work because the girl had seen a performance somewhere and come home with that particular look on her face. The look that said she had heard something that had changed the shape of what she thought was possible. Diane sat in the hallway of a Keth military facility 30 light-years from Lagos and listened to her sister's voice describing the look on a 12-year-old's face. She sent back a message that was longer than she'd planned and probably embarrassingly sincere, and she told her sister to let the girl take the piano lessons and she would sort out the C. Lost at the next opportunity, and she meant it completely. The information officer came and told her about the vote. She thanked him. She sat in the corridor for a while longer. Erath Solon found her there eventually. The commander sat down beside her on the corridor bench, which was not something Diane had expected. The bench was clearly not designed for someone of Erath Solon's rank to be sitting on informally in a hallway, and she sat there anyway, and they were quiet for a moment. The work begins tomorrow, Erath Solon said. The hardening contracts, the load distribution modeling, the diplomatic filing around the station seizure. There is a great deal to do. There always is, Diane said. I want to ask you something else, the commander said. All right. When the council was running those 11 hours of projections, Erath Solon said, and you were sitting in the back of the room, you knew, for some portion of that time, that you were seeing something we were not seeing. Oh yes, Diane said. How long? Diane thought about it. Maybe hour 3, I wasn't certain until about hour 7, but the itch was there by hour 3. And you waited 4 more hours before speaking. I wanted to be sure, she said, and I needed to think about how to say it. There's no point in seeing the right thing if you say it wrong. Erath Solon was quiet. You are a strange kind of warrior, she said finally. I'm not a warrior at all, Diane said. No, Erath Solon said, I know, that is what makes it strange, she paused. The Keth tradition holds that the greatest quality in a war council is the ability to remain calm while calculating, To take the full measure of a situation without fear or hope distorting the numbers. We train for this, we select for it. A pause, and you were calm, but not because you had removed fear and hope from your calculation. You had simply weighted them differently. You were afraid of the wrong outcome. And you hoped for something that looked nothing like what we were hoping for. Diane thought about this. What were you hoping for? To win, Irath Solin said. It was a simple answer, almost embarrassingly simple for a War Council commander. What does that mean? Diane asked. A long pause. I am not certain I know now that you ask. I was hoping, Diane said, that the network keeps running, that the supply chains hold. That in 15 years the contested corridor is a place where people can get what they need more easily than they can now, and they don't know why and they don't care why, and that's fine. That's actually the whole point. She paused. Victory that people notice is usually victory that costs too much. The best outcomes are the ones nobody has to celebrate. Irath Solin sat with this for a long time. Then she said, in the intimate dialect, not the formal register, not the working group language, but the one between warriors of equal standing who have arrived somewhere real. You saw us, all 11 of us, the most decorated strategic minds in the Second Coalition. You saw us running the wrong calculation, and you were afraid to say so, and you said so anyway. Oh yes, Diane said. Because the cost of staying quiet was higher. Because I gave myself my word, Diane said, and was slightly surprised to hear it come out that way. Before I got on the ship to come here, I told myself if I see something, I say it. Even if it costs me, I don't always manage it, but I try. The commander was quiet for a very long time. When she spoke, it was carefully, and with the particular weight of someone adding something to a record they intend to carry. The Keth, she said, have always believed that the most dangerous thing on any battlefield was a warrior who could not be stopped, who had gone past the point of calculation and simply would not stop. A pause. I am revising this belief. The most dangerous thing is someone who has looked at the whole situation and decided that telling the truth is the only acceptable option, because that person has already paid the cost in their own mind. There is nothing left to threaten them with. Diane said nothing. She did not think she was dangerous. She thought she was tired, and she had bad posture, and she still had coffee breath, and she was going to call her sister back properly when she got back to her bunk and could actually hear the audio clearly. She thought about a 12-year-old girl who had heard something that changed the shape of what she thought was possible. She thought about 4 nodes on a network map, quietly being made stronger in the dark, carrying the traffic of lives. She thought about the right question. 6 months later, the relay station was still under Gret occupation. The 4 nodes were fully hardened. The load-balanced routing was running so cleanly that 2 of the corridor's largest shipping operators had filed requests to expand their contracts, citing improved reliability. The Gret's diplomatic ins. Trements were still grinding through the Interstellar legal system. Their analysts, according to the Coalition's intelligence reports, had spent 4 months trying to understand why the network had not responded to the seizure the way their models predicted. Diane had returned to her regular logistics work. She had given 3 briefings to different parts of the Coalition's advisory structure and had declined 2 requests for formal interviews because she did not think she had done anything that required explaining at length. She had answered her sister's messages on time mostly. She had made arrangements for the piano lessons. She was eating lunch in a small common area on the outpost civilian level when Irath Solin found her. The commander sat down across from her. She was not in formal attire. She looked, Diane thought, like someone who was somewhere deliberately off the record. She set something on the table between them. It was a small object, about the size of a closed fist. It was the deep bronze color of old Keth military composite, the same color as the corridor walls. It was shaped in a way that Diane's translation chip identified, somewhat uncertainly, as a Keth navigational marker. the kind used historically by scouts and advance units to indicate that a piece of terrain had been assessed and found passable. We do not traditionally give these to people who are not Keth, Irath Solin said. This particular one is from the campaign that established the Second Coalition's founding boundaries 62 years ago. Diane looked at it. I can't accept something like this. It is not a gift, Irath Solin said. It is a notation, a formal notation in the Keth record-keeping tradition which happens to take physical form. A pause. It says that this terrain has been assessed, that the line of passage is clear, that those who come after may advance. She slid it across the table. Diane looked at it for a long moment. She thought about the things she could not unsee once she had seen them. She thought about being a person who could not look away. She picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. She set it in the pocket of her jacket, next to her tablet and her stylus, and the 2 protein bars she always kept there because you never knew. She looked back at her lunch. The next advisory council meeting is Thursday, she said. Yes, Irath Solin said. I'll have the updated node capacity projections ready. Good, the commander said. They ate lunch together in the small common room, and the network hummed on around them, carrying its 10,000 invisible things, and nobody in the contested corridor who was not in that room had any idea how different everything looked from the inside of the calculation that had not been made. If you stayed all the way to the end, then you already know what made Diane dangerous, and it had nothing to do with weapons, rank, or being the smartest person in the room. It was the moment she asked herself what it would cost to stay quiet and didn't like the answer. That's the thing about humans in these stories that keeps bringing people back. We're not the strongest. We're not the fastest. We just have this stubborn habit of asking the wrong question until it turns out to be the right one. If this story landed somewhere in you, please subscribe and leave a comment. It genuinely means everything to know someone out there is listening. Until next time, keep asking the question nobody asked yet.